What's up, guys? This is TheKephas. Today we will be checking out the macro that I've created for Destruction Warlocks starting out in the War Within. Now, this video might be dropping shortly after the actual release of the War Within, but this is designed for people starting out, which means that the macro and the build are for level 70 and lower, and as you progress through you can use it sort of as a starter macro is the idea. So no hero talents are going to be considered just yet. We're setting things up for the future and we're just focusing on getting started in this expansion. So I want to make sure that that's understood for people that might be confused why we're not even looking at hero talents. As you can see, I am a level 70 warlock and I am playing in Destruction. So let's take a look at this tree. Now this one was a little bit trickier than I actually thought it would be, because the core rotation of Destruction Warlocks is actually pretty easy, and the core rotation itself is easy enough to macro, but there are some really tempting abilities that can be added through the talent tree, which I've opted not to take too many of because it would complicate things in regards to trying to fit everything in a macro and have that macro work really well. So I've gone for an extremely simple build that should keep things as straightforward as possible so that the macro will function better and it will make macroing easier. In the future, I will come back and look at this and see if there's something that I can do that can incorporate more, especially once we get into hero talents. But for now, I've gone with something that is as simple as possible. And so if you do want to take any extra abilities that are not included in the macro, feel free to do so, but you would definitely want to manage those on separate buttons, at least for now, until we can take a look at things more in depth later on. So the left side of the tree, as most often is the case, isn't all that important when it comes to the macros. It's the macro itself, because most of the left side is going to be utility or just passive buffs to some of your abilities, so you can pretty much do whatever you want on the left side of the tree. There's really nothing to go over at all. There are some obviously good stat bonuses that you can get, increasing the effectiveness of some of your abilities, but overall it's pretty straightforward. Now on the right side is where we definitely want to talk about some things. So there are obviously at the top, you kind of take the standard stuff, getting those abilities. Backdraft is something that we're going to have to keep in mind when we look at the actual macro, but we'll talk about that later. And then when we get down into the actual macro itself, one of the first major choices was between Mayhem and Havoc. Essentially, Mayhem makes Havoc a passive random cast is the idea there. So Havoc might be more efficient, it might be more effective because you have more control over it, but that would make it an ability that would most likely have to be managed on a separate button because it would only be for AoE situations. So I've opted for the passive route so that you don't have to worry about it at all. So for simplicity, it's definitely easier to go Mayhem over taking the actual Havoc ability, okay? And so we do have Rain of Fire. That's another thing that we're gonna have to talk about, especially in terms of soul shards and whatnot, so that's something else as well. As we get on down here, there's a lot of passive. There's some abilities in here that I'm not taking. I'm almost always going for passives when I can. The first and really only extra ability that I've added to this rotation is Shadow Burn, because this is a really simple, it does consume a soul shard, but it also restores a soul shard if the target dies after being used, so that's kind of nice. But this will use up some of your soul shards for sure, and again, that will be something that we will talk about as we get closer to the actual macro part of the playstyle. So yeah, adding in Soul Shard, and we're going to be using that one. And then there are some other abilities that are really cool, and they're also very difficult in terms of how this macro is set up and using them. So first up is Summon Infernal. We've taken that one, but that will behave similar to Rain of Fire, and so we'll mention that later. And then you have these really cool abilities like channel demon fire. This is cool. This is a channeling ability. We can make this work, but when we look at how the macro is set up, it's, again, we're going for simple and taking in as few abilities as possible. But this is a great ability. It's mainly useful for AoE situations anyways. That's another reason why I didn't take it, because then it's something that I have to, you know, decide if it's, should I put it in the macro, should it be used outside the macro. So I think either way, if you take this, you know, you're going to want to put up all those immolates on as many targets as possible anyways, and then you're going to use it. So this is not something that I would consider putting in a macro. It would definitely be something that I would put outside of the macro and then just track it on a separate button. The real stuff gets down into the bottom here. So yeah, the first thing is Soul Fire. It's a really cool ability. It can reset, has a longer cooldown, it generates soul shards. We can make this work. Again, it would make things a little more complicated with how we have the macro set up, so the macro functions. But yeah, this one we could probably make it work, but for now it's not being included. And that also applies to the Rift ability. So this is another one that's really cool ability. Kind of the same idea here. Both of these we could certainly in theory make them work, but with how this class plays and trying to, you know, make the macro function well, adding in these in will make things a lot more difficult. So I've chosen not to. Now, something that will help is going down this route. So taking, like, we'll get our free rifts with this one, so that's kind of cool, and then we don't have to worry about it. This can either give you a free rift randomly, or it can reset a charge if you take this ability. So this is cool. So you still kind of get a bit of the rifts happening here. And then of course, this is very important because this will make us generate more soul shard fragments, which will help us out. So that's why I've kind of gone this way. So it's a bit of a simplistic build, and possibly over simplistic in terms of performance compared to other builds, but this is going to make playing the class easier, and it's also going to make the macro function better, and that's why I have chosen to go with this build for now. So yeah, that's kind of the idea there. So we've talked about this macro a lot, just talking about that. So let's go ahead and open up the macro and we'll take a look at what we've got going on here. Now this is going to be one macro. Fortunately, we have a lot of our, you know, stuff that's passive, which is going to help us out a lot. Now there are a couple of abilities that will have to be managed on separate buttons, and obviously your ground targeting abilities are going to be ones that you're going to have to manage on separate buttons. So like Rain of Fire, Summon Infernal, those are ground targeting abilities, and there's no easy way to macro them because they are ground targeting abilities, and since you're a caster, you don't want to target them at your feet with an @player command, and so there's no easy way to make them work reliably. So there's definitely ones that you're going to have to manage on separate buttons. The other one is your dot immolate. This is a ability that you only use enough to keep immolate up on the target. It does not have a cooldown. You don't want to be spamming it, so putting it in the macro efficiently is not ideal, and I always opt to just simply manage my dots with a separate button. So other than that, the macro is going to cover everything else for both single target and for AoE. You will just have to manage those buttons, you know, as you need them, which, you know, for a dot, one dot, it's not too bad. And certainly, you know, if you're fighting multiple enemies, it's easy enough to just switch targets and keep that up. And then of course, you know, you've got, you know, Rain of Fire, which you only use in AoE, and then of course immolate, or not immolate, sorry, Infernal, which you only really use occasionally anyways. So either way, they're pretty easy to manage on separate buttons, and the macro will manage everything else for you. So let's go ahead and actually take a look at what this macro can do. Okay, so we start things off with a loop. This is a reverse priority loop. I like to use these. And this is a caster class, and caster classes are always going to be the more challenging classes to make macros for. So this is what I've come up with, and it seems to be working pretty well. So first thing up is Shadow Burn, trying to prioritize that first because it, you know, it does have a cooldown, but we also want to make sure that we are using it and keeping it on cooldown. So we're using soul shards, prioritizing them for this over anything else, and so that's obviously pretty important. Then of course, next up we have conflagrate. That's important as well. We want to be keeping this one on cooldown and using the charges for it to generate soul shards. And then lastly in this loop is incinerate, okay? And this is our passive, or not passive, but our filler ability. This is the one we're going to be using when we have nothing else to do. And so the challenge with a loop or with a passive ability like this for every caster that has one is that we don't want to be using it too much and having it overtake the macro so that nothing else gets used, but we also don't want to not give it an opportunity to be used enough and then the macro hangs because we're trying, you know, to use other abilities that are not available because they're on cooldown or we don't have enough soul shards or something like that. And so this, I found, is the best way to do it, putting it in a shorter priority list, like up to 3 abilities, putting it at the bottom of the priority list, and that way it's not taking too long to get to immolate, and it's also not putting immolate too high up in the priority so that it's getting overused is the idea there. And so that's not immolate, sorry, incinerate. I get those 2 abilities mixed up all the time, and I apologize if you're confused. So yeah, so incinerate being our filler, we don't want to use it too much, we also don't want to not use it enough. So that's the idea. So abilities inside of this loop are the priority in terms of how this macro is going to try to use them. In other words, they're the abilities we want to be trying to use most often, okay? And so we have a repeat of 3, which means that the macro is going to go through this sequence loop in this pattern 3 times, and then it's going to go outside of the loop and use whatever's on the outside. And for this macro on the outside is Chaos Bolt. So originally I had Chaos Bolt at the top of the priority and just simply using it to make sure that we're never overcapping our soul shards, but that created a couple of problems. One, we never had soul shards for anything else, so we never had soul shards for Shadow Burn, and we never had soul shards for Rain of Fire. And so putting it on the outside of the macro and only having the macro try to use it occasionally should, for the most part, keep it from using your soul shards too quickly so that you have enough time, say, primarily to use Rain of Fire if you're in AoE situations, and also giving your macro time to try to use Shadow Burn a little bit more often to make sure that's being kept on cooldown, which is good because it does have a cooldown, which means that you won't be using all of your soul shards just on Shadow Burn, and the macro will occasionally try to use Chaos Bolt. So every 3 times the macro goes through this loop, it will try to use Chaos Bolt. And so in my experience, this is kind of the other thing I'm trying to juggle, is using Chaos Bolt enough primarily in single target situations that we're never overcapping our soul shards, but also not using it too much so that we're never having enough soul shards to do anything else. And that's the other challenge. So trying to get the macro to, you know, find the sweet spot for both incinerate, our builder, our primary filler builder, and also Chaos Bolt, our primary single target spender, has been the biggest challenge. And this setup, for the most part, seems to be doing a pretty decent job at this. But you have to remember that, as always with any of these macros, there's always going to be setbacks, there's always going to be drawbacks, and they're never going to perform as well as a skilled player executing their rotation appropriately. So that's always something that you have to keep in mind. They are limited in what they can do. So that means that there are going to be times where you might hit your soul shard cap, okay? And there also might be times where you use up all your soul shards when you would like to really use a Rain of Fire at that time. I'm not saying that's never going to happen, okay? The other thing is backdraft. I mentioned it earlier. So backdraft, ideally you want to follow up using Conflagrate with Chaos Bolt, right? And then even if you have multiple stacks, you ideally don't want to use Conflagrate and then use Conflagrate again. You want to make sure that you're getting the benefits of backdraft before you use a Conflagrate again. The way I have this set up right now, and the most reliable way to do it, that's not necessarily going to always happen, okay? And so you may not always get the most out of backdraft with this setup, and I can't really think of a solid, consistent way to ensure that you always get the benefit of backdraft, at least not yet. Like I've spent a lot of time trying to set this up and getting it to work. I've leveled up a character using it, and this is just kind of like I like to try to keep my macros as simple as possible. Like, I don't like to use like cast sequences if I can avoid it. I'd like to try to keep things as straightforward as possible. And this is kind of, the best I've come up with so far. Your macros aren't able to, detect when you have buffs or procs or whatever. So that's just something like another kind of like weakness of using macros like this. But functionally, the macro will keep all of your abilities on cooldown. You can manage your dot and your ground targeting abilities on separate buttons. Otherwise, the macro is going to take care of everything else for you, and it should be a relatively smooth and simple experience if you want to play a warlock. And then, of course, if you want to get into harder content, you can kind of branch off and learn to use the rotation and get into like that more sweaty or harder content that way, right? If that makes sense. So this is kind of just for simplicity, for casual, play style, like most of these are really. So I hope this was informative. If you'd like to use this macro, feel free to import it into your game using Gnome Sequencer. Don't forget to hotkey it. That's very important. And if you use it, let me know what you think about it in the comments below. With all that being said, I will see you guys on the next one. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, let me know by clicking that like button. And feel free to share it with your friends so they can enjoy it as well. And if you'd like to see more videos, you can subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to be notified as soon as new videos are posted. You can also follow me on Facebook, and if you'd like, you can support my work on Patreon. Links to all that stuff can be found in the description below. This is TheKephas. Until next time.